The morning of May 11th, 1945, Radar Picket Station Number 15, 40 miles northwest of Okinawa, Lieutenant Commander Baron Mullaney stood in the cramped Combat Information Center of the destroyer USS Hugh W. Hadley, watching the green sweep of his air search radar paint contacts that made his blood run cold. 156 Japanese aircraft were converging on his position. 2 destroyers, 4 small landing craft support ships, and a handful of American fighters were all that stood between this kamikaze swarm and the invasion fleet anchored off Okinawa's beaches. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Mullaney reached for the fire control solution being calculated by his Mark 37 gun director, a sophisticated electromechanical system that combined radar tracking with analog computers to aim his 5.5-inch guns. But sophisticated was a relative term. The system needed time, precious seconds to track a target and calculate the complex ballistics required to put a shell into 3-dimensional space where an aircraft would be moments later. Time was exactly what he didn't have. The first wave of attackers was already screaming toward his position at 300 miles per hour, diving from the clouds in coordinated attacks that the Mark 37 had never been designed to handle. What happened in the next 90 minutes would demonstrate the single most decisive technological advantage America possessed in the Pacific War. And it wasn't radar, wasn't the atomic bomb, wasn't even the sheer industrial capacity that allowed the United States to build ships faster than Japan could sink them. It was something far simpler, yet infinitely more deadly. A wine bottle-sized device packed into the nose of every shell his guns would fire. The Japanese had no equivalent, no countermeasure, no answer. They would aim their anti-aircraft guns manually, calculating leads by eye, adjusting by watching their tracers arc through empty sky. The Americans would fire shells that hunted their targets with invisible radio waves, detonating automatically at the precise moment to turn near misses into kills. By the time the smoke cleared and the last burning aircraft spiraled into the Pacific, the difference between these two approaches would be written in blood and wreckage across 40 square miles of ocean. The Hadley and Evans would claim 23 and 4 confirmed kills respectively, defending against odds that should have been mathematically impossible to survive. The technology that made this possible had seemed equally impossible just 5 years earlier. The path to this morning's slaughter began not in the laboratories of wartime America, but in the pre-war recognition of a problem that every major navy faced but could not solve. Japanese aircraft were simply too fast, too maneuverable, and too numerous for existing anti-aircraft systems to stop effectively. In 1941, before America entered the war, hitting an aircraft with anti-aircraft fire required either a direct impact, extraordinarily difficult against a target moving at hundreds of miles per hour, or a timed fuse set to explode at a predetermined altitude. The statistics were damning. At the war's start, it required approximately 20,000 shells to down a single enemy aircraft. Some estimates ranged as high as 100,000 rounds per kill. The mathematics were simple and brutal. If conventional anti-aircraft fire required that many shells per aircraft, and Japanese attacks were coming in waves of dozens or hundreds of planes, no ship carried enough ammunition to defend itself. No fleet could produce enough shells to survive sustained air attack. The British had explored the concept of proximity fuses as early as 1939, developing prototypes that used small radar systems to detect when a shell approached a target. They had working devices that functioned perhaps 50% of the time under ideal conditions. For military use, this was inadequate. More critically, the British lacked the industrial capacity to manufacture such complex devices in the quantities required. Their factories were already stretched to breaking, producing conventional munitions and trying to replace the material hemorrhaging from defeats across Europe and North Africa. Germany had reached even further, exploring over 30 different proximity fuse designs in the 1930s, including acoustic sensors that would trigger on engine noise and electrostatic detectors that would respond to charged aircraft surfaces. By 1939, German researchers had concluded the technical challenges were insurmountable. The devices required vacuum tubes small enough to fit inside an artillery shell, yet robust enough to survive the violent acceleration of being fired from a gun. When a 5-inch shell is fired, it accelerates from 0 to 2,600 feet per second in roughly 20 feet of gun barrel. This creates an acceleration force of 20,000 times the force of Earth's gravity. Every component experiences a crushing force equivalent to being hit by a sledgehammer. The shell then spins at 25,000 revolutions per minute as it travels through the rifled barrel. The delicate glass vacuum tubes available in the 1930s would simply disintegrate under such stress. Hitler's leadership issued directives in 1940, prioritizing only projects that could reach production within 6 months to support the coming invasion of the Soviet Union. Germany's proximity fuse programs were among the casualties. Limited work would resume in 1944, far too late to affect the war's outcome. The Japanese never seriously pursued proximity fuse development, focusing instead on expanding their anti-aircraft gun batteries and improving the training of their gun crews. This decision would prove catastrophic. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized quantity over technological sophistication in anti-aircraft defense. The Type 96 25mm gun became the standard Japanese anti-aircraft weapon, mounted in single, double, and triple configurations across every warship in the Imperial Japanese Navy. By 1945, major Japanese warships carried over 100 of these guns, creating walls of fire that looked impressive but achieved remarkably little. The Type 96 had severe limitations that Japanese naval architects understood but could not overcome. The guns used 15-round magazines that required constant reloading, creating frequent stoppages in fire. The sights were adequate for slow-moving aircraft, but inadequate against the faster American planes that dominated the skies by 1944. Even when equipped with powered mounts, the guns could not train and elevate rapidly enough to track diving aircraft effectively. Most critically, Japanese anti-aircraft fire control was entirely manual. Gunners aimed by eye, calculating the lead required to hit a moving target through experience and instinct. Tracers helped them adjust their fire, but every adjustment meant more shells wasted, more time lost, more aircraft closing unmolested toward their targets. The Japanese estimated that their Type 96 guns required an average of 1,500 rounds to shoot down an aircraft at a height of 1,000 meters and a range of 2,000 meters. Fire beyond that range was completely ineffective. Japanese heavy anti-aircraft guns, the larger caliber weapons designed to engage aircraft at longer ranges, faced equally severe problems. The Type 94 director for heavy anti-aircraft fire proved much too slow. After the disaster at Midway, the Japanese Navy rushed development of the improved Type 3 director, but the prototype was never completed. Only triple 25mm mounts had access to the Type 95 director. All other guns used open ring sights, primitive devices that relied entirely on the gunner's skill and luck. This created a massive tactical disadvantage that Japanese naval commanders recognized but could not solve. Their ships could throw enormous quantities of steel into the sky, but hitting fast-moving aircraft required either saturation fire at close range or extraordinary luck. The doctrine evolved toward holding fire until American aircraft were within 800 meters, maximizing hit probability, but giving the Americans long approach windows where they faced no effective opposition. The American approach was fundamentally different. Rather than accepting the limitations of existing technology and trying to compensate through volume of fire and improved training, American scientists and engineers set out to solve the impossible problem of building a proximity fuse that actually worked. The National Defense Research Committee, formed on June 27, 1940, brought together leading American physicists and engineers under the direction of Vannevar Bush. Among them was Merle Toover, a physicist whose brilliant but volatile temperament would drive a team that eventually numbered over 1,000 scientists and engineers. The problem they faced was straightforward to state but seemingly impossible to solve. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Make a fuse that could detect when it approached a target and detonate automatically. Pack it into the nose of a 5-inch artillery shell, make it survive the violence of being fired, make it work reliably enough for military use, and make it manufacturable in the millions. Every major power had concluded this was impossible. The Americans decided to do it anyway. The team at what became the Applied Physics Laboratory of Johns Hopkins University, established on March 10, 1942 in a rented Chevrolet garage in Silver Spring, Maryland, settled on a radio-based proximity fuse using Doppler radar principles. A miniature transmitter in the nose of the shell would emit radio waves at approximately 180 to 220 MHz. When these waves struck a target and reflected back, the frequency would shift due to the Doppler effect. When the reflected signal reached a predetermined frequency, indicating the target was within lethal range, an electrical circuit would close and detonate the shell. The theory was elegant, the engineering was nightmarish. Consider what had to fit inside the nose of a 5-inch artillery shell. A complete radio transmitter and receiver, a power source, safety mechanisms to prevent accidental detonation. All of this occupying less space than a wine bottle, weighing less than 3 pounds, and leaving room for 7 pounds of high explosive in the shell behind it. All of this had to function in extreme temperatures, survive storage for months, and most daunting of all, withstand the shock of being fired from a gun. James Van Allen, a young physicist who joined the Applied Physics Laboratory in April 1942 as a founding member, faced the task of developing what the team called rugged vacuum tubes. He started with miniature tubes that Raytheon and Sylvania had developed for hearing aids, designed for the gentle environment of sitting in someone's pocket, not the violence of artillery fire. Working with Sylvania Company engineers, Van Allen redesigned the tubes from first principles. The glass envelopes were thickened and carefully annealed. The internal filaments and grids were redesigned with shorter spans and heavier cross-sections. The tubes were potted in wax inside the fuse body, cushioning them against shock. Every aspect was tested by firing complete fuses from a vertical gun into the ground at the Naval Proving Grounds in Dahlgren, Virginia. The soft earth caught the shells gently enough that researchers could recover the fuses and examine the tubes under microscopes to see what had broken. Through hundreds of test firings and thousands of design iterations, the team gradually developed tubes that could survive. By September 1941, they were achieving success rates above 50%. The Navy, desperate for any improvement in anti-aircraft effectiveness, accepted this failure rate and authorized mass production tooling. The engineers were confident they could improve reliability during the production ramp-up, and they were right. By early 1943, reliability had climbed above 90%, but vacuum tubes were only one challenge among many. The fuse needed a power source that could activate instantly when the shell was fired and provide steady power for the few seconds of flight time. The team developed a battery that used the setback force of acceleration to complete the electrical circuit, a brilliantly simple solution that made the fuse inherently safe during handling and storage. The radio components had to be equally robust. Engineers miniaturized transmitters and receivers, then packaged them in ways that could survive not just the initial acceleration, but also the spinning motion of the shell and the aerodynamic stresses of supersonic flight. Quality control became absolutely critical. A single weak solder joint, a slightly misaligned component, a tube with microscopic flaws, any of these could cause a fuse to fail, and failures at the wrong moment meant dead gunners and lost ships. Manufacturing expertise came from an unlikely source. The Crosley Corporation, better known for making radios and refrigerators, became the primary contractor for fuse production. They brought assembly line expertise and the kind of meticulous attention to quality control that consumer electronics demanded. Other contractors included RCA, Eastman Kodak, General Electric, and Sylvania. By late 1943, these companies were collectively fight par, producing 40,000 proximity fuses per day. The scale of production was staggering. From December 1941 to August 1945, American factories manufactured over 22 million VT proximity fuses. The designation VT stood for variable time, a deliberate misnomer designed to conceal the fuse's true nature from enemy intelligence. The security surrounding these fuses was extraordinary, exceeded only by the Manhattan Project. Early in the war, VT fuses were authorized only for use over water, where duds would sink and remain beyond enemy reach. The first combat use came on January 5, 1943, when Lieutenant Red Cochran, commanding the aft 5-inch battery on the light cruiser Helena, shot down a Japanese Val dive bomber with the second of 3 salvos of VT-fused shells near Guadalcanal. The target was making a standard diving attack, the kind that conventional anti-aircraft fire struggled to counter effectively. Cochran's shells, guided by their miniature radar systems, detonated in a pattern that filled the sky with shrapnel at exactly the right moment. The Val disintegrated. That single kill demonstrated what the statistics would eventually prove with overwhelming clarity. In 1943, naval guns fired 36,370 anti-aircraft rounds in the Pacific Theater. Although only 25% used proximity fuses, these accounted for 51% of all kills. The VT-fused shells had a lethal fragment area of 3,000 square feet compared to 60 square feet for conventional timed fuses. A near miss became as effective as a direct hit. The mathematics of lethality told a story that Japanese naval commanders could see but not counter. American destroyers equipped with VT fuses required an average of 155 rounds per kill in 1943. This improved to 421 rounds per kill in 1944, not because the fuses became less effective, but because American doctrine shifted to opening fire earlier, taking advantage of superior logistics that ensured unlimited ammunition supply. By 1945, when the Kamikaze threat reached its peak, VT fuses were being used at rates unimaginable even a year earlier. The contrast with Japanese capabilities was stark and growing. While American fire control systems were being upgraded with improved radar and faster analog computers, Japanese fire control remained fundamentally unchanged from pre-war designs. The Mark 37 gun director that American destroyers used combined optical rangefinding with radar tracking, feeding continuous target data to Mark 1A, fire control computers that calculated complex ballistic solutions automatically. The system had limitations. It required time to set up, seconds that seemed like hours when kamikazes were diving at 400 miles per hour. The Mark 1A computer was designed assuming targets would maintain constant course and speed, an assumption that kamikaze tactics deliberately violated. Skilled operators learned to work around these limitations, using what they called rate control mode to generate firing solutions more quickly. But even the best operators needed those critical seconds. What made American destroyers truly lethal wasn't the fire control computer alone. It was the integration of that computer with VT-fused ammunition. The fire control system only needed to get shells into the general vicinity of the target. The fuses handled the final precision, detonating automatically when they detected reflected radio energy from the aircraft. This created a weapons system far greater than the sum of its parts. Japanese ships had no equivalent integration because they had no proximity fuses to integrate. Their fire control remained a manual process of visual tracking, human calculation, and hope. Against pre-war aircraft, this approach had been marginally effective. Against the faster, more numerous American aircraft of 1944 and 45, it was simply inadequate. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 demonstrated this disparity with brutal clarity. American carrier task forces faced massive Japanese air attacks, waves of aircraft that should have overwhelmed the defending fighters and ships through sheer numbers. Instead, American fighters, guided by radar-equipped combat information centers, intercepted most attackers far from the fleet. Those that penetrated the fighter screen faced a wall of VT-fused 5-inch fire that destroyed aircraft at ranges where Japanese ships would have been unable to score hits. The result was a massacre the Americans called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But turkey shoots required 2 elements: overwhelming superiority and targets that couldn't effectively fight back. The Japanese had been the latter since the VT fuse's introduction. They simply hadn't faced a situation where the disparity became obvious until the scale of the attacks grew large enough to make the statistics undeniable. Okinawa would be that situation, and May 11th, 1945 would be the day when the mathematics of technological superiority translated into the most intense anti-aircraft battle any destroyer had ever fought. The Hadley and Evans had been assigned to Radar Picket Station number 15 on May 10th, taking position 40 miles northwest of the Okinawa transport area. Their mission was early warning and fighter direction, using their radar to detect incoming raids and vector combat air patrol fighters to intercept. It was dangerous duty. Picket destroyers formed the outermost defensive ring around Okinawa, making them the first targets for Japanese attackers and often the most exposed. By May, the Kamikaze campaign had reached desperate intensity. The Japanese Fifth Air Fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Matome Ugaki, had marshaled every available aircraft for the defense of Okinawa. Young pilots with minimal training were climbing into obsolete aircraft, carrying enough fuel for a one-way trip, focused entirely on the mission of crashing into American ships and inflicting maximum damage before dying. Traditional skill in flying, in air combat, in navigation, none of this mattered when the goal was simply to point your aircraft at a ship and hold course until impact. What did matter was getting through the defensive fire. Every second a kamikaze remained airborne under fire was another chance for anti-aircraft shells to find it. Every meter of altitude sacrificed to evasive maneuvers was space that couldn't be recovered before impact. The tactics evolved toward massed attacks from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming the defender's ability to track and engage multiple targets. This was the environment the Hadley and Evans entered when they took station on the afternoon of May 10th. Intelligence indicated a major kamikaze attack was being prepared. The question wasn't whether it would come, but when, and how large it would be. The answer came in the pre-dawn darkness of May 11th, when radar operators detected the first contacts forming up over Kyushu. By 7 in the morning, the scope showed over 150 aircraft in loose formation, heading directly for their position. Mullaney ordered his crew to general quarters and began vectoring the few available combat air patrol fighters toward the incoming raid. 4 Corsairs against 156 Japanese aircraft. The math was impossible, but the fighters bought time, diving into the formation and breaking up the coordination that Japanese attack commanders tried to maintain. Single aircraft and small groups began peeling off, some damaged, others simply losing track of their wingmen in the swirling combat. But most kept coming. At 08:35, with the first aircraft clearly visible from the bridges of both destroyers, the Mark 37 directors locked on and the 5-inch guns began firing. VT-fused shells arced skyward, and 3 seconds later the first detonations appeared, black and orange flowers blooming in the morning sky. A Zero, part of the fighter escort that was supposed to protect the attacking bombers, staggered as shrapnel tore through its engine. It didn't explode dramatically. It simply lost power, nosed down, and spiraled into the ocean 5,000 yards from the Hadley's starboard beam. The Japanese pilots could see the airbursts, could understand what they meant. American shells were exploding without hitting anything, filling volumes of sky with lethal shrapnel that made traditional evasion tactics useless. There was no safe altitude, no clever maneuver that would allow them to slip through. The Americans were creating barriers of fragmentation in 3-dimensional space, and flying through these barriers meant death or crippling damage. At 08:41, a Zeke dove on the Evans from the starboard quarter, a classic kamikaze approach, steep and fast, giving the defenders minimal time to track and fire. The Mark 37 on Evans swung to track, the crew feeding continuous updates to the fire control computer below decks. 3 salvos, 9 shells, the 3rd salvo detonating directly in the Zeke's flight path. The aircraft flew into the expanding cloud of shrapnel and came apart, wings separating from the fuselage, the whole burning mass tumbling past the ship to impact 800 yards off the starboard beam. This was the kill ratio American planners had calculated and Japanese commanders had feared. Against manually aimed fire, that Zeke would have had perhaps a 30% chance of pressing home its attack successfully. Against VT fuses, the probability dropped below 5%, and that 5% existed only because of the sheer speed of the attack, giving gunners limited engagement time. Given enough time, given enough shells, American, Destroyers could create a defensive bubble that was essentially impenetrable. The problem was that Okinawa had taught the Japanese exactly how to penetrate that bubble. Coordinated attacks from multiple axes simultaneously forced the Americans to choose which targets to engage, which attackers to let through. Exploit the Mark 37's limitation of tracking only one target at a time. Saturate the defenses with more aircraft than could possibly be engaged before some broke through. At 0920, the Japanese executed this tactic perfectly. 10 aircraft, Zeeks and Vals, and a mixed formation of bombers attacked the Hadley simultaneously from ahead and astern. The Mark 37 could track only one. The 40mm and 20mm guns engaged the others, shorter-ranged weapons without the benefit of radar tracking or proximity-focused ammunition. Raw volume of fire, tracers arcing through the sky, gunners leading their targets by instinct and experience. The 5-inch guns destroyed 4 aircraft in rapid succession, shells detonating in perfect sequence to create a barrier no aircraft could cross. The automatic weapons accounted for 3 more, one bomber exploding spectacularly when incendiary rounds ignited its fuel tanks, 2 others shredded by the converging fire from multiple gun tubs. But 3 got through. A bomb hit aft, penetrating the deck and exploding in the engineering spaces below. A Bucker, the rocket-powered suicide bomb that the Japanese had designed specifically for kamikaze attacks, slammed into the superstructure. 2 Zeeks crashed into the ship in quick succession. Damage control parties were already moving before the 3rd aircraft hit, trained responses taking over as fires erupted and flooding began. The Hadley's engineering spaces were compromised, power flickering, but the 5-inch guns still had ammunition and the VT fuses still worked. Mullaney ordered continuous fire, any aircraft within range. Saturate the sky with proximity-focused shells and let the mathematics of fragmentation handle the killing. For the next hour, the Hadley fought alone after the Evans was knocked out of action by 4 kamikaze hits in quick succession. 1 destroyer, its engine rooms flooded, fires burning in multiple compartments, down to 50 men still able to fight out of a crew of over 300. Against the remnants of the Japanese attack, still over 60 aircraft hunting for targets, the 5-inch guns never stopped firing. Shells up from the magazines, into the hoists, into the guns, fire control solutions updated continuously as the Mark 37 tracked targets through the smoke and chaos. VT fuses detonating, shrapnel patterns overlapping, creating layers of lethal fragmentation that turned the sky into a killing field. The Japanese kept coming, driven by duty and desperation, and the Americans kept shooting, each shell carrying a device that represented years of research, millions of dollars of development, and an industrial capacity that could manufacture miracles by the tens of thousands per day. By the time the attack ended, the Hadley was a floating wreck, her survival a testament to damage control expertise and sheer stubborn refusal to sink. But she had downed 23 aircraft, a record for a single engagement that would never be broken. The Evans, dead in the water since 0900, had accounted for 4 before losing power. The 4 landing craft support ships combined claimed additional kills. Against 156 attacking aircraft, the tiny group had destroyed or damaged over 40, and the survivors faced the long flight back to Kyushu with dwindling fuel and the knowledge that they had failed to sink even one of their primary targets. The difference between success and catastrophic failure had been measured in those wine bottle-sized devices. The VT proximity fuses had turned good shooting into perfect shooting, converting near misses into kills, allowing a handful of destroyers to generate defensive fire that should have required an entire task force. Without the fuses, the Hadley and Evans would have been overwhelmed in the first 20 minutes. With them, they survived the most intense kamikaze attack of the Pacific War and wrote a page in naval history that validated every hour of research, every dollar of development cost, every ounce of industrial capacity devoted to making the impossible possible. The Japanese never developed effective countermeasures. Electronic jamming was theoretically possible, but required understanding the fuse's operating frequency and characteristics. Without intact working fuses to analyze, German and Japanese engineers could not determine the specifications needed for jamming equipment. The Americans had been extraordinarily careful about security, restricting use to overwater environments where duds would sink beyond recovery, and prosecuting any security breach with extreme prejudice. Even if the Japanese had determined the specifications, deploying jammers across every potential target would have been impossible with their limited industrial capacity. Physical countermeasures were equally ineffective. The fuses operated by detecting reflected radio waves. Reducing the radar cross-section of aircraft was difficult and would have compromised performance. The human body itself reflected enough energy to trigger the fuse at close range. The only defense was dispersion, spreading aircraft widely enough that a single shell would not catch multiple targets. But dispersion reduced attack coordination and made formations easier for fighters to break up. It also didn't solve the fundamental problem that VT-fused shells could destroy single aircraft with far greater efficiency than conventional ammunition. The Japanese were trapped in a tactical box with no exit, facing a weapon they could not counter and could not replicate. The final months of the war saw Japanese aviation ground to near impotence, not just through pilot losses, but through the sheer futility of attacks against American ships. The psychological impact of VT fuses was as significant as the physical destruction. Pilots who survived one mission and watched their comrades torn apart by shells that detonated without hitting anything, who understood that American ships could create barriers of shrapnel that made successful attacks require not just skill and courage, but extraordinary luck. These pilots faced a second mission, knowing the odds were overwhelmingly against survival. Kamikaze attacks had been conceived as a way to maximize impact per pilot, a mathematical trade that accepted certain death in exchange for a high probability of damaging or sinking a ship. But VT fuses broke that mathematics. Certain death remained, but the probability of successful attack dropped below levels where the trade made strategic sense. Japan continued kamikaze operations because no alternative remained, but the effectiveness declined as American anti-aircraft capabilities improved and the quality of available pilots deteriorated. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.